John Miller never imagined the day would come when his own daughter Lisa would look him straight in the eye and say the words that cut deeper than any wound. "Dad, you're a burden. You can't live here anymore. You're sitting quietly." At her kitchen table, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long gone cold, when she delivered the sentence that would change everything. Lisa, the youngest of his 3 children, the one he and his late wife Mary had once spoiled, with ice cream cones and bedtime stories, now stood before him, not as a daughter, but as a judge passing down a cruel verdict. Her husband, Mark, remained silent in the corner, his arms crossed as though the decision had already been made long before John heard it. John, 78 years old, had given his entire life to family and work. In the small-town garage where he spent decades repairing cars, he had worn his body down to keep food on the table and shoes on the feet of Lisa and her siblings. Now, in the twilight of his life, he found himself treated not as the man who had sacrificed everything, but as an unwanted guest. The silence that followed Lisa's words was heavier than steel. And in that silence, John realized something every parent dreads. Sometimes the people you love the most forget the weight of the sacrifices that built their lives. John Miller wasn't born with much. He grew up in a small Ohio town, the kind where people measured a man not by what he owned, but by how hard he worked. And John worked harder than most. From the time he was 17, he was already under the hood of cars, his hands blackened by grease, his back sore from bending over engines for hours on end. 16-hour days weren't rare for him. They were routine. He didn't mind the long hours. What kept him going was the thought of his wife Mary, waiting for him at home with a warm meal on the table. Mary was his steady ground, the one who reminded him why the sacrifices mattered. Together, they built a modest but loving life. Their children never went to bed hungry, never left the house with holes in their shoes. And though John never had a college degree or a big title, he carried the quiet pride of a man who had provided no matter the cost. Lisa, his youngest, had been his little shadow when she was a girl. He remembered her running down the driveway when she heard his old Chevy pull in after work. "Daddy, you smell like the garage," she'd laugh, clinging to his coveralls. Back then, her giggles were the sweetest payment for his sweat. He would lift her onto his shoulders, letting her feel taller than the world, never imagining the day would come when she'd push him away. Life wasn't easy. The bills stacked up, the winters were harsh, and there were nights John worked until his hands trembled, and he never let his children see the struggle. If the lights stayed on, if there was milk in the fridge, then he considered himself as successful. Mary often told him, "John, you're the backbone of this family." And he believed it not because he wanted glory, but because he knew it was true. Without his labor, without his endless hours, their home would not have stood. When Mary passed away, the house felt hollow. Her absence weighed heavier than any load John had ever carried. For the first time, he found himself unsure of where to go at night. That's when Lisa spoke up. She told him he could move in with her and Mark. At the time, John's heart swelled with gratitude. He thought it was a sign of love, a daughter stepping up to do what families are supposed to do, look after each other when the years take their toll. But once inside Lisa's home, things shifted. At first it was small remarks. "But Dad, you left the faucet dripping." "Dad, do you really need to keep the lights on this late?" Mark's silence spoke volumes to the sighs, the crossed arms, the way he avoided meeting John's eyes at dinner. John brushed it off, convincing himself it was just the stress of busy lives. He told himself he could make himself smaller, quieter, less noticeable. Still, deep down, he felt it. He had become a guest in a place that was supposed to feel like home. His pension check barely covered groceries, and even though he slipped Lisa a few dollars here and there to help, he could sense the tension building. The warmth of family dinners faded, replaced by short conversations and the clicking sound of forks against plates. John didn't complain. After 78 years, he knew how to hold his tongue. But in the stillness of the night, lying on the small bed in the spare room, he replayed the memories of Mary's laughter, of his children's younger days, of what family used to mean. And he wondered how could so many decades of sweat and sacrifice lead to this? What John didn't know, at least not yet, was that the story wasn't ending here. The years of grinding at the garage, the long nights saving every extra penny, even the old habits of tucking things away just in case, all of that was about to matter in a way Lisa never saw coming. Because while she believed her father was weak, dependent, and broke, John had quietly prepared for a day just like this one. And when it came, he would show her that a man's worth is never measured by the roof over his head, but by the resilience in his heart. Most people thought John Miller was just another old man trying to stretch a small Social Security check from month to month. Lisa certainly believed it. To her, her father had nothing left but memories and bills. What she never knew, what no one knew, was that John had been planning for years, quietly, patiently, in the way only a man who had lived through lean times knows how. Back when his kids were young and every dollar mattered, John learned how to tuck away what little he could. A few dollars from a side job fixing a neighbor's lawnmower, little cash from helping out with late-night towing calls when the shop was slow. He didn't waste much on himself. Clothes were patched, boots resoled, shirts worn thin. Still worked, John kept it, no matter how old it looked. The savings, though small at first, grew steadily hidden in a bank account under his late brother's name so nobody could touch it. It wasn't greed that made him do it. It was survival. John had seen too many men work themselves to the bone, only to end up with nothing when their bodies gave out. He told himself, just in case, Johnny, just in case life pulls the rug out from under you. And now standing in his daughter's kitchen, branded a burden. He realized that just in case had finally arrived. But money wasn't his only secret. Years earlier, when his knees were still strong and his hands steadier, John bought a small house in a forgotten corner of rural Ohio. To anyone else, it looked like a shackwood siding weathered gray, a tin roof that leaked when it rained. But to John, it was hope. On weekends, while Mary thought he was out fishing, he'd drive down to that little place with a box of tools in the truck bed. Slowly, plank by plank, he rebuilt it. He fixed the roof, patched the walls, added a simple porch where a man could sit and watch the sun set behind the hills. Mary never asked where he went. She trusted him. Maybe deep down she knew what he was doing. He wasn't building a getaway for himself. He was building a safeguard for his family for the day when the world might turn cold. Now, Lisa's harsh words still ringing in his ears, that old house didn't seem like a side project anymore. It felt like destiny. That evening, John pulled his gray blazer from the closet, slipped his wallet into the inside pocket, and walked out the door without a word. Lisa didn't try to stop him. Mark didn't even look up from the television. It was as though he had already vanished from their lives. But John knew better. He hadn't vanished. He was just beginning again. The bus ride to that little town was long and quiet. Out the window, he watched the familiar landscape shift into open fields and country roads. The kind he hadn't traveled in years. He remembered when Lisa was a girl, riding shotgun in his Chevy, pointing at cows in the pastures and asking 1,000 questions about the world. Those memories hurt now, but they also fueled his steps. When he reached the property, twilight had already settled. The house stood waiting, still weathered, still humble, but strong. He slipped the old brass key into the lock, half worried it might not turn after all these years, but it did. Inside, dust floated in the air, carrying the faint smell of pine. Wood he had once sanded smooth. The old cot was still in the corner. The small table was still by the window. On the shelf sat a faded photograph of him and Mary on their wedding day. He had placed it there long ago, almost as though he knew. One day he'd need her presence again. John sat down, letting the silence wash over him. For the first time since Mary's death, he felt in control. It wasn't someone's burden. He wasn't a problem to be solved. He was a man with a plan, and that made all the difference. No one in Lisa's house would have guessed it. But John had been preparing for this moment all along. And as he laid back on the cot that night, the wood creaking beneath him, he whispered into the stillness, "You see, Mary, I wasn't as helpless as they thought." John Miller didn't slam the door when he left Lisa's house. He didn't raise his voice, didn't argue, didn't beg for a second chance. That wasn't his way. After nearly 8 decades of living, he knew that dignity is best carried in silence. He simply slipped into his old gray blazer, the same one he'd worn to weddings, funerals, and Sunday services, and straightened the lapels as though preparing for a ceremony only he understood. Lisa had pressed a folded piece of paper into his hand just minutes earlier. On it was the address of a nursing home, typed neatly, as though the decision had been finalized weeks before. She didn't meet his eyes when she gave it to him. Mark didn't even get up from his chair. For John, that was answer enough. He wasn't family anymore. He was an obligation. They were eager to move elsewhere as he stepped onto the porch. A chill cut through the evening air. He paused, gripping the railing, feeling the ache in his knees. There was a time when Lisa would have wrapped her arm through his, guiding him down the steps, laughing about how she'd take care of him when he was an old man. That promise now felt like a cruel echo. Neighbors were outside, raking leaves and chatting, but no one noticed John walking down the sidewalk with nothing but the clothes on his back. He carried no suitcase, no bags, no reminders of the years he'd spent under his daughter's roof. To an outsider, it might have looked like a man on an evening stroll. But John knew the truth. He was leaving one life behind and stepping into another. At the corner, he stopped to catch his breath. A car rolled by, headlights brushing across his weathered face. He could have taken a cab to the nursing home. He could have called an old friend for help. But instead, he reached into his pocket and touched the small brass key he hadn't used in years, the key to the little house he'd kept hidden. It reminded him he still had choices, that he wasn't as powerless as Lisa believed. As he waited for the bus, he thought about Mary. She'd always told him, "John, never let the world decide your worth. You carry that with you." He could almost hear her voice in the wind, steadying his steps. That memory gave him strength to climb aboard when the bus finally arrived. Inside, the hum of the engine filled the silence. Families sat together, children fidgeting in their seats, couples whispering plans for the weekend. John sat alone, his hands folded tightly in his lap. He wasn't embarrassed by his solitude. In fact, a quiet pride swelled in him. Lisa might think she had cast him aside, but he knew better. He wasn't being discarded. He was reclaiming himself. The bus rumbled past, familiar landmarks. The diner where he'd once treated Lisa to pancakes after school. The church where he and Mary had renewed their vows on their 40th anniversary. The old park with the swings Lisa used to beg him to push higher and higher. Each sight carried a sting. But instead of breaking him, the memories reminded him of who he was, a man who had always stood tall for his family, even if they no longer stood with him. When the bus rolled into the rural stop near his hidden house, John stepped down carefully, his hand tightening around the rail. The night air smelled of cut grass and wood smoke. The streets were quiet, lit only by a few flickering lamps. He pulled his blazer tighter and walked with the measured pace of a man who knew exactly where he was headed. That night, as he slid the brass key into the lock of the small wooden door, John realized something. Walking out of Lisa's house had not been an ending. It was the beginning of the chapter he had unknowingly prepared for all along. He had left behind rejection, yes, but he carried with him something far more powerful, dignity, and that, he thought, was worth more than any roof someone else could offer. The little house stood just as John Miller had left it years before, weathered, quiet, and waiting. The porch creaked under his boots, the wood worn smooth by seasons of rain and sun. He turned the brass key, half expecting the lock to resist, but it gave way with a soft click, as if welcoming him back. Inside, the air was cool and carried the faint scent of pine from boards he had cut long ago. Dust floated in thin beams of light from the street lamp outside. A single wooden table rested by the window, 2 chairs pushed close together as though Mary might still sit across from him. In the corner, the old cot stood, its frame a little crooked, but sturdy enough to hold a tired man. John set his blazer on the back of a chair and sat down heavily, letting the silence wrap around him. For the first time in years, he wasn't listening for footsteps in the hall or whispers behind closed doors. There were no signs of impatience when he shuffled too slowly, no reminders about dripping faucets or rising utility bills, just peace raw. Unfamiliar, but real. That night, he lit a small lamp, pulled a blanket from the trunk, and stretched out on the cot. The mattress was thin, the springs stiff, but it felt like a throne compared to the spare room at Lisa's house. As he closed his eyes, he whispered Mary's name. It had been so long since he felt like he belonged somewhere, and in that moment, he knew he had finally come home. The next morning, sunlight slipped through the thin curtains, casting a golden glow on the floorboards. John rose slowly, joints stiff, and stepped outside. The town was waking. A dog barked in the distance, a tractor rumbled on the far side of the hill, and the air smelled of fresh earth. He splashed cold water on his face from the basin by the door and felt more alive than he had in years. He walked to the small grocery store on Main Street, nodding to the clerk behind the counter who seemed surprised to see him. With a firm but quiet confidence, John pulled out the bank card tied to the savings no one knew about. The young teller raised her eyebrows at the balance on the screen. But John only smiled, taking out enough for a sack of groceries, bread, beans, coffee, and a little butter. It wasn't much, but it was more than enough for one man who valued independence above luxury. Back at the house, he boiled water for coffee on the old stovetop. As the smell filled the room, he thought about the years he had spent worrying whether his family saw him as useful. Here, usefulness no longer mattered. What mattered was that he could stand on his own. He sipped slowly, letting the warmth chase away the cold that had lingered in his bones since Lisa's words. Over the next few days, John began putting the house in order. He opened windows to let the breeze sweep out years of dust. He scrubbed the table, patched a loose shingle on the roof, and stacked wood by the porch for colder nights. Each small task reminded him that he was capable. Each strike of the hammer and sweep of the broom stitched back pieces of his dignity. But the house wasn't just a refuge. It became a mirror, showing John who he still was beneath the years of wear. He was a man who could build, repair, and endure. A man who had survived rejection, but refused to be broken. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, John sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, watching the sky shift from gold to crimson. He thought of Lisa and the silence that had followed her cruel words. It hurt, yes, but the sting no longer defined him. Here, in this simple house, he was free to decide his own worth, and though no one else knew it yet, John had more than enough strength, and more than enough secrets too. Start over. The days in the little house began to settle into a rhythm. John Miller woke with the sun, brewed his coffee on the old stove, and worked steadily at restoring the place. He patched cracks in the walls, sanded down splintered boards, and even swept the porch each evening, just as Mary used to do. There was comfort in the routine, quiet reminder that life still had meaning even in solitude. Then, one evening, the phone rang. The old rotary phone startled him. It hadn't rung in years. For a moment, he just stared at it, wondering who in the world would call a man most people thought had disappeared. Slowly, he lifted the receiver. Dad. The voice was small, trembling. It was Lisa. There was a long pause before she spoke again. I shouldn't have said those things. Shouldn't have asked you to leave. Please, can you come back home? John sat in silence. The phone pressed against his ear. He could hear her breathing, uneven and shaky. In another time, he might have rushed to comfort her, to brush aside her mistakes. But now, the wound was still too fresh. He finally spoke, his voice steady. Lisa, I forgive you, but I won't be coming back. Her sobs cracked through the line. Dad, please. Marky says he was wrong too. We'll do better, I promise. I just want you here. John's eyes fell on the worn table where he had set his coffee cup. The house smelled faintly of sawdust and fresh air, a smell of self-reliance. He realized something profound. In that moment, forgiveness and returning were not the same thing. I love you, Lisa, he said gently. But I need to live on my own terms now. I've earned that right. There was silence on the other end, and then a soft, broken whisper. I understand." When John hung up the phone, he didn't feel triumphant or bitter. He felt resolved. For so long, his life had revolved around being needed, being useful, being the provider. Now, for the first time, he was choosing himself not out of selfishness, but out of respect for the years he had given. That night, he sat on the porch, watching the moon rise over the hills. The air was cool, carrying the scent of grass and wood smoke. He thought about Lisa's tears and the regret in her voice. It hurt him. No father enjoys hearing his child broken by guilt. But he also knew that stepping back was the only way she would truly see him for who he was, not a burden, not a leftover responsibility, but a man of dignity. The next morning he rose earlier than usual. The air was crisp, the sky painted with streaks of orange. He poured himself a fresh cup of coffee and whispered a quiet prayer. Not for himself, but for Lisa. He hoped she would find the strength to face her own mistakes, just as he had faced life's hardships. In the days that followed, John noticed something changing within him. The weight of Lisa's rejection no longer felt like a chain around his neck. Instead, it had become a kind of fuel. Each nail he hammered into the old walls, each log he'd chopped for the stove, seemed to echo the same truth. He wasn't living to prove her wrong. He was living to remind himself he was still strong. It struck him that maybe Lisa's regret was not an end, but a beginning. Sometimes it takes losing someone to realize their worth. And though John had no plans to return to her home, he held on to a quiet hope that one day their relationship would be rebuilt not out of obligation, but out of true respect. As the sun set that evening, John leaned back in his chair, the gray blazer folded neatly. On the armrest beside him, he smiled faintly to himself. "Mary," he whispered, "she's starting to see. Maybe not all at once, but she's starting." And for the first time in a long while, John didn't just feel like a man surviving. He felt like a man finally living on his own terms. The days in the small house began to take on a comforting rhythm. John Miller would rise with the sun, stretch his aching shoulders, and breathe in the cool morning air. He swept the porch, made himself a modest breakfast, and filled the house with the familiar smell of black coffee. Wasn't much, but it was his, and every task reminded him he was standing on his own 2 feet again. Still, old habits die hard. John had worked with his hands his whole life, and sitting idle never suited him. One morning, while sweeping sawdust off the porch, he glanced at the worn toolbox sitting by the door. The hammers, wrenches, and screwdrivers inside were the same tools he'd used at the garage decades earlier. He picked up a wrench, held it for a moment, and chuckled to himself. "Guess I'm not ready for the rocking chair just yet." Very afternoon, John walked into the hardware store on Main Street. Don Peterson, the owner, raised his eyebrows when he saw him. "Well, I'll be. John Miller? Thought you'd retired for good?" John smiled. "I did. But a man's hands still remember what they were made to do." Before long, John was helping stock shelves, fixing a broken lock, and organizing bins of nails and screws. Don didn't pay him much, but John didn't care. What mattered was the work. The scrape of metal against wood, the smell of sawdust, the rhythm of tasks that kept his body moving. It all reminded him he still had something to give. Word spread quickly in the little town. People began stopping by his porch with questions. A neighbor asked if he could take a look at a squeaky door hinge. A boy from down the road brought him a bicycle with a broken chain. Before long, John realized he'd stumbled into something unexpected. He wasn't just fixing things. He was being needed again. At first, it was mostly odd jobs. But then, something else happened. A couple of teenagers, curious about the tools laid out on his workbench, began hanging around. They asked him questions. "Mr. Miller, how do you loosen a rusted bolt without breaking it? Or can you really patch a tire with just a piece of rubber?" John would laugh, pull up a stool, and show them. Soon, those casual visits turned into regular afternoons. The boys would bring their friends, and before long, John's little porch became a gathering spot. He found himself teaching not just about tools, but about patience, about not forcing something that wasn't ready to move, about steady hands and steady hearts. In the evenings, after the kids left, John would sit with his notebook, writing down the lessons he'd shared. Not just mechanical tricks, but the kind of wisdom that had carried him through a lifetime. Always keep a little for tomorrow. Don't measure a man by what he owns, but by what he builds. Almost without notice, he was no longer defined by the rejection he had faced in Lisa's home. He was building something new, something bigger than himself. The hurt was still there, yes, but it was being replaced, piece by piece, with purpose. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills and the air turned cool, John leaned back in his chair, listening to the laughter of the boys down the road as they rode off on their freshly repaired bikes. He felt a warmth in his chest he hadn't known in years. It wasn't about money. It wasn't about pride. It was about knowing he still mattered, that his hands, his stories, his life experience could shape the next generation. And though he hadn't planned it this way, John realized he was no longer just fixing broken things. He was fixing himself. Life in the little town had become steady for John Miller. Each day carried its own rhythm: morning coffee on the porch, hours of tinkering with tools, and afternoons spent guiding the neighborhood kids who gathered to learn from him. It was a quiet, honest life, the kind he thought would carry him gently into his final years. But one afternoon, that calm was interrupted by a knock on the door. When John opened it, he was greeted by a young man in a crisp white shirt and tie holding a leather briefcase. "Mr. John Miller?" he asked politely. "Yes," John replied. Cautious, he wasn't used to strangers in suits showing up at his modest home. "My name is Daniel. I'm an attorney from the city. I've been asked to deliver some papers regarding property you once owned." For a moment, John's brow furrowed. Property. He hadn't bought land in years, not since that little house he was standing in now. But as the lawyer opened the folder and laid out the documents on the table, memories stirred. Decades earlier, back when his children were still young, he had purchased a piece of land on the outskirts of town. Back then, it was nothing more than empty fields and rocky soil. He had almost forgotten about it, Daniel explained patiently. "The state purchased the land to expand the highway. Because the deed is still under your name, you're entitled to compensation." John leaned back in his chair, stunned. He hadn't expected this. His mind raced compensation for land he hadn't thought about in years. The lawyer slid a check across the table. The number written on it made John's chest tighten. It wasn't just a little extra money. It was enough to change things. Enough to live comfortably for the rest of his life. That night, John couldn't sleep. He sat on the porch with the check folded in his pocket, staring at the stars. For years he had taught himself to live with less, to stretch every dollar, to survive quietly. And now, out of nowhere, life was offering him abundance. At first he thought of simple things. Maybe he could buy a new truck, replace the old cot with a real bed, or finally put a proper roof on the house. But as the night stretched on, his thoughts shifted. He remembered the boys who came by every afternoon, eager to learn. He thought of the town itself, young people leaving for the city. Old trades disappearing, neighbors struggling to keep their kids on the right path. John realized something important. The money wasn't just an opportunity for him. It was a chance to leave something behind. Not a house or a car, but a legacy. The next morning, he walked to the hardware store and found Don Peterson, the owner. Over a cup of black coffee, John shared his idea. He wanted to use part of the money to create a workshop, a place where young people could learn trades, keep their hands busy, and build skills that would last a lifetime. Don listened quietly, then nodded. "John, that's the kind of thing this town needs, and you're the right man to lead it." It wasn't going to be easy. The building they found was an abandoned warehouse near the square. Its walls were cracked, the roof leaked, and dust covered every surface. But when John walked through the empty space, he didn't see ruin. He saw benches lined with tools. Kids huddled around engines and bicycles, laughter echoing through the halls. Work began almost immediately. John rolled up his sleeves, hammer in hand, and the kids who had once lingered on his porch showed up eager to help. Together, they scrubbed the floors, painted the walls, and turned the hollow shell of a building into something alive. Each day, as he worked alongside them, John felt a new energy surge through him. By the time the workshop opened, the whole town had taken notice. Parents stopped by with their children, curious to see what was being built. Some donated old tools, others brought food for the workers. Slowly, the project became bigger than John himself. It became a community effort. And standing there, watching the first group of young apprentices learning how to change a tire, John realized the truth. The windfall wasn't a gift of money. It was a gift of purpose. The workshop had only been open a few weeks when John Miller saw a car pull up outside one Saturday afternoon. He was inside, tightening bolts on an old lawnmower, while two boys watched closely. Through the wide doorway, he noticed the car door swing open, and his heart skipped. It was Lisa. She stepped out slowly, wearing jeans and a plain shirt, her hair tied back. No makeup, no forced smile, just her, looking smaller than he remembered, almost fragile. And behind her, climbing carefully out of the back seat, were two children, his grandchildren, faces he hadn't seen in far too long. For a moment, John froze. His hands stilled on the wrench. Memories crashed in the sting of her words. The night he walked away, the sound of her voice breaking on the phone. He never expected to see her standing there, not in this place, not now. Lisa walked toward the open door, her eyes wide as she took in the scene. Teenagers at work benches, kids riding bicycles fixed with John's steady hands, shelves lined with tools. She swallowed hard before speaking. "Dad," she said quietly, her voice barely carrying over the clatter inside. "I wanted them to see what you've built." The boys at John's side stepped back respectfully, sensing this moment wasn't theirs. John set down his wrench and wiped his hands on a rag. He met Lisa's gaze for the first time in months. She didn't look away. They sat at one of the long tables, the children wandering curiously among the tools. For a while, neither spoke. Then Lisa lowered her eyes and said, "I thought you were barely getting by. I thought you needed me. I didn't realize you had." All this. Her hand motioned around the workshop, her voice cracking. John took a deep breath, steady but gentle. "Lisa, I never wanted you to see me as a burden. That wasn't fair to either of us. But I also didn't want to prove my worth with money or property. A man's value isn't in what's in his pocket, it's in who he is and how he lives." Tears welled in her eyes. She covered her face with her hands, just like she had when she was a little girl who had scraped her knees. For a long moment, she simply cried. And though it hurt him to watch, John didn't interrupt. He let her carry the weight of her own realization. Finally, she whispered through her hands, "I was wrong, Dad. I let pride and fear make me push you away. I thought I was protecting my family, but all I did was break it apart." John's chest tightened. He had dreamed of hearing those words, but now that they came, they weren't sweet. They were heavy, aching with truth. He reached across the table and rested his calloused hand over hers. "I forgive you, Lisa," he said softly. "But forgiveness doesn't mean things go back to the way they were. I found a life here. I can't undo that." She nodded, tears streaking her face. "I don't want things the way they were," she admitted. I want us to find a way to be family again, even if it's different." The children ran back over, one holding up a wrench and asking what it was for. John chuckled and ruffled the boy's hair. "Hit that, son, is for loosening something that's stuck.
No.
But you've got to be patient. Too much force and you'll break it." Lisa watched, her eyes glistening. She understood the deeper meaning in his words. That evening, as the sun dipped low, Lisa and the kids left the workshop. She turned at the doorway, hesitating, then whispered, "Thank you, Dad, for still being you." A light, the sound of tools clinking behind him, and realized the truth. Sometimes, the hardest repairs aren't to engines or houses, they're to hearts. And though it might take time, even the deepest cracks can be mended. The weeks that followed brought a gentler rhythm to John Miller's days. The workshop was alive with the sound of laughter, the scrape of tools, and the quiet determination. of young hands learning old skills. John no longer felt like a man left behind. He felt like a man whose story had found a second chapter. Lisa came by from time to time, never with the same urgency as before, but with something softer in her presence. Sometimes she brought his grandchildren, who eagerly tugged at his sleeves, begging him to show them how to fix a bike chain or hammer a nail straight. Other times she came alone, just to sit with him on the porch while the evening breeze stirred the trees. They didn't always talk about the past. Some wounds didn't need to be reopened, but there was an honesty in their silence that hadn't been there before. John understood something now that he hadn't in the heat of his pain. Love doesn't always come wrapped in the way we expect. Sometimes it falters, sometimes it even wounds us. But if there's space for forgiveness, it can find a way to return. Not unchanged, but stronger for having been broken. One evening, as the last light of day faded, John sat at his workbench. With his notebook open, he wrote slowly, his hand unsteady, but his thoughts clear. He wrote about dignity, about the strength of standing tall even when the world calls you a burden. He wrote about Lisa's tears and the moment she admitted her mistakes, and how it wasn't wealth or hidden plans that healed their bond. It was the simple act of forgiving, of choosing to see each other with fresh eyes. He closed the notebook and leaned back, gazing at the workshop filled with tools and memories. The hum of the radio played softly in the background, and he felt a peace he hadn't known in years. For the first time since Mary's passing, his heart felt light. And here's the truth. My friend, the one lesson John wanted to pass on: no matter how many times life tries to convince you that you're useless, you must remember this: you are never a burden when you choose to live with dignity. When you keep giving, teaching, and loving in your own way, the world may forget your sacrifices. Even your family may stumble, but your worth is not decided by their blindness. It's carried in your actions, in the legacy you leave behind, and in the love you choose to keep alive. So if you're listening right now, I want you to pause and think, who in your life needs forgiveness? Who needs to be reminded of their worth? And maybe more importantly, have you forgotten your own? If this story touched your heart, leave a comment below and share your thoughts. Love to hear your experiences, your lessons, your second chances. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because stories like John's remind us that even when the world turns its back, there's always another chapter waiting to be written.